Hello and welcome to Coup Save America. I am Sean Steinhardt. Today we're going to do something a little different. I've been suffering from a bout of pain in this past week or so, and so my prep time hasn't been quite on par. But what we're going to do instead of a typical monologue, although we may add one later, probably not. Um, what we're going to do instead, though, is we're going to go ahead and jump right into our guest. Now, as a lot of you may not be familiar with, British Prime Minister Boris Johnson has resigned following a wake of controversies and so forth. And that kind of brings to question a lot of similarities between the United States and the United Kingdom. Boris Johnson has been called Britain's Donald Trump, although I think Boris Johnson's a little bit more appealing. Um, there's also Brexit, and so there's a lot of parallels that are kind of happening here at the same time. And so we have a person coming to us. He is a political commentator. He's got a number of interesting podcasts that I highly recommend. We'll give you a list at the bottom there, down in the description. And we're going to be talking a little bit about Brexit and some of the parallels that exist between the United States and Great Britain. See, America doesn't have to make itself, where America has to make itself great again, Great Britain's already great by default. So there we go. So with that, my friends, we're going to bring in our guest, Tim Healy.
Well, hi, Sean.
Welcome
Thanks,
to the show. How are
thanks
you?
for having me on. Yeah,
Great.
I'm cool.
Yes. So, how's the
I'm
Queen?
cool.
Have you talked to the Queen?
Not recently, but I have in the past.
Oh, well, you should give her a call. Hey, have her on the show. And
I'm working on it.
so, as I said, there's a lot of parallels, I think, happening between the United States and the United Kingdom. Boris Johnson has resigned following, what we are told here in the United States has been a sort of a tenure that's plagued with scandal. So for those of us, and I'll be honest, I've looked into Brexit. I've tried to understand it, but maybe it's just coming from this American mentality or just not getting the right information. Can you tell us a little bit about Brexit and kind of what led to that happening, the impetus for that?
Yeah, I mean, need to go back a little ways to around about 1973 when the United Kingdom first looked at joining the European Economic Community, what it was at the time, the EEC. It was a trading bloc, essentially. The reason we went in the first place, and we joined it in 1974, was purely to make trade between the UK and the European continent easier. Prior to that, we were having to use, in fact, quite a long time after we joined, we were still having to use customs clearance forms, VAT forms, one thing and another, for moving goods to and from the European Union or Europe as it was at the time. That was fine. The original thing that we went into was just for trade.
Right.
As it developed over time, it became the European Union that wanted to get its fingers into every single aspect of our lives. They wanted to dictate to us what immigration rules we had, what laws we had, what everything to do with our lives they wanted to meddle with. And quite a few years ago, there was a big movement pushing to leave the European Union that it had become. And David Cameron was pushed and pushed and pushed, and one of his election promises was to hold a referendum to see whether the people of the United Kingdom wanted to stay in the European Union or they wanted to leave. He thought he had it in the bag. He was a Remainer. The country had the single biggest turnout for any election ever. I think it was somewhere around about up in the 90%. 17.4 million people voted to leave the European Union. 16.1 million people wanted to remain, and that was what was on the ballot card, whether to leave the European Union or to remain in the European Union. Overwhelmingly, I think it was 54% or 52% to 48% for leaving the European Union. David Cameron had to leave office, and we had an election then, and the worst thing possible, imaginable, happened. The Conservative government brought in Theresa May, which was a disaster because she was essentially a Remainer, and her negotiating skills were poor to say the least. And over the last 6 years, the Remain side of the argument have done everything they could possibly do to undermine and stop Brexit actually happening. We've actually kind of left the European Union now, but we haven't. We're still paying them millions of pounds every week to for some reason. I don't know why. We're still bound to them by the European Convention on Human Rights. Although we've kind of left the single market and the European single market, we're still effectively tied to it.
Now, what do you mean by the single market?
Well, the European Union became, or the EEC became a single market. So it's a single market. Everybody kind of pays the same VAT on goods moving around the European Union. And we've actually effectively left that. But part
so
of
the market
the UK
would be kind of, in economic terms, like a nation in a sense. Not a nation, but for economic purposes, it would be treated as an independent nation. Correct?
Yeah, absolutely.
Oh, okay.
So, effectively, we've left that. Although part of the European part of the United Kingdom is still part of it, which is Northern Ireland. Effectively, we've split our country in half, and we put a border down the Irish Sea, which is absolutely scandalous. And what's happening is all the goods that are travelling between Europe, the British mainland and Northern Ireland are subject to checks and tariffs, whether they're going south of the border or not. The vast majority of stuff that's going into Northern Ireland from England or Great Britain is going into Northern Ireland. It's not going south of the border. But the European Union, 20% of the checks across the whole of the European Union are on that border going into Northern Ireland. 20% of the whole of the European Union is being checked, which is way disproportionate. The European Union are doing everything in their power to make life very difficult for the UK, basically, because they're punishing us.
Or I mean, is this like right now that this is happening? I mean, is this sort
of?
of?
Yeah, it's been happening since the last 6 years since we've gone over since we voted to leave the European Union. The European Union have done everything in their power to make life difficult. They're effectively punishing us to stop anybody else in the European Union from looking at leaving the bloc. And that's what's happening.
What? So you mentioned leaving the European Union, the Convention on Human Rights. Can you
Yep.
talk about some of the issues that would necessitate having to abandon that?
Okay. The European Union have the what they call the Schengen area, which is free movement
Right.
across the whole of Europe. We've opted out of that. Well, actually, we never opted in to the Schengen. We were forced to have effective open borders. Since we've left, we've had we pulled out of that, and we have a closed border, and we have a massive crisis at the present time with illegal migrants coming across the English Channel in small dinghies every single day. This year alone, there's I think the latest figures are around about 14,000. Last year there was 28,000 illegal migrants crossed the English Channel. This year they anticipate it's going to be close to around about 60,000 crossing the English Channel illegally coming into this country without any documentation whatsoever to say who they are and where they've come from. We've put in place a process where we should be able to take these people that have come in illegally, put them on an aeroplane, fly them down to Rwanda for processing. So far, the one flight that was due to go ended up with only two people, and they scratched the flight because somebody in Strasbourg, some lawyer in Strasbourg, says we can't do it under the ECHR.
Okay.
And that's what's really scuppering what we can do in this country to eject these illegal migrants that's coming into the country, and that's part of the EU.
What are some of the I'll be honest, I'm more of an open borders proponent. From but what are the is this migrate illegal migration happening? I mean, is that happening more as a consequence of the global crises that are kind of happening, or is that do you see that as specific to Brexit?
Personally, I don't think it's got anything to do with Brexit. It's got more to do with economic migrants leaving predominantly the African states, predominantly places like Iraq, Iran, Afghanistan. I mean, Afghanistan is slightly different because we've got in place those people that work for us, the ARAP scheme, which is assistance force for anybody that work for us to bring them into the country legally. What they have to do is they've got to leave Afghanistan with their papers, report to somewhere like Islamabad, to the British High Commission or the British Embassy in Pakistan or Iran, and the permanent joint headquarters will take over and bring them into the UK. Once they come into the UK, they hand them over to the Home Office, who then put them up in hotels until they can find somewhere for them to live. The problem we have in this country is that we haven't got anywhere for people to live. We've run out of space because the UK, although it's a small country, it's vastly overpopulated at the moment, and there isn't enough
Right.
housing, there's not enough infrastructure, hospitals, doctors, all of the schools, all of that sort of thing. The infrastructure's not there to be able to cope with the influx of legal and illegal migrants that's coming into the country at the moment. And we've got somewhere around about 40 to 45,000 illegal migrants living in hotels, costing the British taxpayer somewhere between £5 and £6 million a day to keep them there.
So it sounds like typical for America. It sounds like all of the places that America has destabilized is creating problems
Yeah.
for. So on behalf of America, I apologize for that. I
Well,
don't think we're done
we have been
destabilizing the world.
party to some of it.
Well, not always willingly though. We've kind of pulled you in.
Yeah.
You talked about the Afghans who helped the troops. We're talking
Yeah.
about translators and such. And America, theoretically, has a similar program where we were going to be bringing those people over here. I mean, they helped us over there in Afghanistan, and they have already been. I mean, their lives are basically at severe risk. They've already been told
Yeah.
by the Taliban that they're going to be killed if they're still in the country. So it's imperative that we remove them as quick as possible. And unlike the United Kingdom, we have not really done that.
Mm.
So I think it's
Well,
interesting just
I
how
could
more
shed
proficient
a
you
bit
guys
more
are.
light. I can
Yeah.
shed a bit more light on that situation. Since August last year, when that absolute chaos happened, I've been helping three of the interpreters that work for me to get out of the country. One of them was caught up in the blast at the airport and missed the flight that he was going for. He'd gone through all the process. He got the flight details. He'd got the permission to go to the airport to get onto the flight. As he was approaching the airport, that bomb went off and he was caught up in all the chaos and he got left behind. Two other guys were down in Helmand province at the time, and they managed to get out. One managed to get out in November and one managed to get out in April of this year. Managed to escape to Pakistan, and they arrived in the country about 2 months ago, and they've been sat in hotels waiting to get moved into housing and stuff like that. Because of the other migrant crisis that we've got going on in the country at the moment, they're stuck in hotels. They've got skill sets that we can use, but the problem is trying to find somewhere to put them where they can start work. It's a massive problem because of the Home Office that deals with everybody that comes into the country that claims asylum, have to deal with them. So the illegals that's coming in without any paperwork, we don't know who they are, where they come from. They've been put up in hotels. What should happen is they're taken out of those hotels, flown to Rwanda, and processed there.
Right.
People that have come in legally through the legal channels should have priority to be looked after and housed. It's not happening, but that's and I
It
guess
seems
that can happen anywhere.
that would be another parallel in terms of infrastructure, because the
Yeah,
United States has not invested in infrastructure for many decades. It's so many of our bridges are on the verge of collapse. We don't have, and somehow it always, when I look at Great Britain, the United Kingdom, I always think of something. Even with the comparisons, like, oh, Boris Johnson is the comparison to Donald Trump. Well, okay, maybe, but he just seems more appealing to me. He just seems more, I don't know, humanish than Donald Trump.
well,
But I think of your healthcare system, and so it's shocking, sort of, to hear that you're struggling with a lot of these infrastructure problems as well.
yeah. I mean, we've got a fairly unique health service in the UK. We pay what we call national insurance, which should go to pay for the National Health Service. And the National Health Service is free at the point of delivery. The National Health Service cost us a huge amount of money. The problem is it's not the amount of money that's poured into it, it's the bureaucracy that they've built up within the National Health Service. The front line, the doctors and nurses can do the job, but they're under increased pressure by the next layer up, which are managers, which are non-clinical managers that have to make targets, that run the budgets and all the rest of it. That's where it all goes wrong. And there's far too many of those sort of middle managers and upper managers that cost the most amount of money. I mean, they put an advert out a little while ago for a diversity and inclusion officer, paying them £260,000 a year. That's close on over $300,000 a year for a diversity and inclusion officer. What's that all about? I mean, the National Health Service is an absolute diverse mixing pot anyway. They don't need diversity inclusion people to tell them how to act, because they're professionals. They do it anyway. But some bright spark decided that that's what's needed, so they've employed 5 of these people on £260,000 a year to come up with stuff that people are already doing, and it's wrong.
You know, it's possible. It's possible that they've hired a few Americans who don't know about diversity, and that's why they've had to hire this person.
It wouldn't surprise me in the slightest.
Because when it comes to diversity, at least from my perspective, you don't. The racism is not there. I mean, even though America is a melting pot as well, diversity does not seem to be as forefront as it is in the United Kingdom, right? I mean, anytime that I see things on TV, and I'm talking about just like news clips, I mean, you see always a very diverse, ethnic group. You don't really see that in most places in the United States, and so it does seem like in the United Kingdom, diversity would is on a whole different level. That it wouldn't be an issue.
I mean, just take a look at the Conservative leadership campaign at the moment, and look at the candidates that are on there. 3 of the candidates are from ethnic backgrounds. Out of the 5, right. I mean, we're down to 3 at the moment, I think. So there's Rishi Sunak, Penny Mordaunt, and Liz Truss are the 3 that's left in the race. So 1 out of 3 is of an ethnic background.
And that's to replace.
We are a diverse country, and we always have been. We've always, ever since the British Empire, we've always been accepting of people coming into the country, and we always look after people that are struggling, that are at risk. Unfortunately, people take liberties with our good nature, and I think that's part of the issue that we have in this country, is that we've got people that are coming into the country illegally, without any documentation. They can't prove who they are, where they're from, claiming asylum, and without, it's not rocket science to work out if they're coming across in dinghies, they're coming from somewhere dodgy. Those that are being persecuted will go to the first place of safety and then claim it there with the documentation.
Right. Well, I mean, depending on where they're coming from, there's different forms of persecution, and as I said, we're dealing with a climate, crisis, multiple wars, genocides. So it's perfectly understandable why people would be trying to flee these places. To be honest, I've actually thought about getting in a dinghy myself and fleeing America and coming over, just for the better healthcare system. It seems like a little bit less insanity over there. So if you see a dinghy with a white guy, that's going to be me.
Well, it's a long way to row.
Yes, well, tides, I'm hoping.
I mean, you could stow away on Queen Mary. I mean, she comes out of New York occasionally.
Yeah, it's striking. So let me talk to you about your healthcare system, because since we brought that up. Has this been a constant problem? Because I know that a lot of, at least again here in the United States, a lot of the news that we're hearing is that there's this push to privatize your healthcare system, which I would recommend strongly against doing that. Um, and again, I think there's a lot that's lost in communication. There's
Mm.
different media narratives. So anytime that I hear anything on the news about a foreign country, I'm always very skeptical as to what if that's being reframed and so forth. So that's why it's fascinating to speak to somebody who has experience with these systems. Um, would you say that well, here, let's go back to the privatization. Is that true? Is there an effort and is there strong support for privatizing the healthcare system?
I don't believe there is. We do have private healthcare. People do get insurance. There's Bupa, and there's a few others that provide private healthcare. I mean, the dentist industry in this country, although it's national health, you go for a checkup, you still have to pay for it. That's not free at the point of delivery. And it's very difficult to be able to get an NHS dentist.
Yeah, what is it with these healthcare systems that don't include dental? I mean, teeth are part of your body. You'd think that that would be just,
Yeah,
healthcare.
but I think it's just the way that it's evolved over the years. So the dentist, the profitable
Yeah.
profitable side of it is the private side. So most dentists have both sides. They'll have the NHS side where they get NHS patients, and then they have a private side where they do the more involved work that the NHS won't pay for. The NHS will pay for the basics of a filling or something like that. But if you want any additional type of work doing, that comes under the private side. So most dentists will take you on as an NHS patient. You'll pay for, I think it's about £27.50 for a checkup. And then if you need any additional work, then if it comes under the NHS remit, you'll get that done for free, like fillings and stuff. If you want any other sort of cosmetic type work doing, that comes under the private side. So swings and roundabouts on that. On the other side of it, the health side of it, the NHS itself, at point of delivery, from my personal experience, has been exceptional. I don't know whether it's because I'm a veteran that I get. I wouldn't say it was preferential treatment. I'm not disadvantaged,
Right.
and I've been under the local health services since I left the military, and for me they've been pretty good. And yes, it takes a little bit of time to get an appointment for anything, but when you see them, they're second to none. The problem with our health services, it's the bureaucracy
Yeah.
that's involved in it, and that starts at the top, and it works its way down through the management levels, and it's the management levels that need to be stripped out, and more clinical staff need bringing in, because the clinical staff that we've got are under pressure. Our doctors' surgeries have been absolutely ridiculous during the COVID.
Oh, yeah, I can imagine.
I mean, trying to get a doctor's appointment has been ridiculous. They say ring 111, which is the helpline, or go to A&E, which is then putting a strain on the accident and emergencies, and people have been waiting ridiculous amounts of time in the A&E departments instead of being able to go to their GP. You ring up for a GP appointment, and it takes several weeks before you can actually get to see a doctor. So that side of it needs a bit of a shake-up.
Well, now, COVID has been particularly hard, ironically, for some of the most advanced developed nations, America and the United Kingdom, for instance. Whereas it seems as though in Germany and some of the other countries, they've dealt with this a lot better. How has how has COVID sort of impacted things over? I mean, how would you say the response to the governmental response has been?
I think from the initial stages back into 2020, where we didn't know an awful lot, the first lockdowns, 3 weeks to flatten the curve, was when it all started going P-tong. From our perspective, we had the government scientific and health advisors were giving us the wrong information.
Yeah.
They spent months and months instilling fear into the nation, skewing the figures that were coming out, and just looking at what they were coming out with on a daily basis. Every day they were coming out with the figures just didn't add up. If you watch the broadcast, you've got Boris Johnson in the middle, you've got Valence and Whitty, who are the scientific and health advisors, giving us all this information. Look at this graph, and this is likely to happen. And they were working off a model by this other Professor Ferguson, who has never ever got anything right. And then you've got the great Barrington Declaration scientists, all coming out saying what you're saying is wrong, it's not happening. They were dissed. The mainstream media cut them off, calling them conspiracy theorists and all the rest of it, and wouldn't broadcast anything. All you got was a nightly dose of this fear being instilled into the population. For the first couple of months, nobody needed to wear a mask. And then all of a sudden somebody thought, well, now we've got all these masks, how about everybody has to wear a mask? And I believe that the whole part of the PPE thing was driven by money. Somebody has made a huge amount of money out of it, and still trying to make it. At the moment we've got a few thousand cases of COVID in the country, and there's sort of noises being made about maybe having to go back into lockdown, or people need to be cautious. Maybe hospitals have now gone back into wearing muzzles, putting masks on again in hospitals. Ridiculous. I mean, you read on after packets. I mean, it's an airborne virus, and it says not suitable for airborne viruses. You couldn't make it up.
Unless it's an N95 mask.
Yeah. And then if you're not wearing it properly, it ain't going to be much use against a microscopic airborne virus anyway. And the vast majority of people that have had COVID, myself included, I've had worse colds, to be honest. It just beggars belief what they've done, and destroyed our economies over it. I mean, that's the biggest criminal part of it. They've destroyed the UK has borrowed somewhere around about £3 trillion. That's going to take several lifetimes to pay off. The interest rates on that are phenomenal. And it's the UK taxpayer that's going to have to pick up the bill. And what they're doing at the moment is they're not making it easy for us.
Right.
I mean, the war on the Ukraine is having an effect. For oil, for food. I mean, a vast amount of food comes out of Ukraine. Wheat, sunflower oil, other foodstuffs are normally come out of Ukraine through Odessa. Odessa at the moment's blocked off by the Russians.
Right.
So not an awful lot's coming out. What is coming out is having to come out through on road from via Poland. The European Union, particularly the Germans, are still giving the Russians millions of pounds a week for oil and gas, funding Putin's war against the rest of us. Because they've put all their eggs in one basket.
With Ukraine.
Yeah, no, with Russia,
Russia,
for
right.
for their oil and gas.
Right.
Whereas the UK, we get about 5% of our oil and gas from Russia. The vast majority of ours comes from Saudi Arabia, South America. I think some comes from America. So
Now, there's talk about, I don't know if this would, there's talk about Russia threatening to shut down a pipeline. I imagine that's going to further add to these costs as well, if that occurs.
well, that's what's pushed up the price of fuel oils. I mean, look at it. I don't know what the price of fuel is in America, but we're paying £2 a litre for diesel.
Wow.
I mean, that's like $2.50 a litre, not a gallon, a litre. $2.50 a litre for diesel. I mean, it's criminal. It's profiteering.
Absolutely profiteering. There's no question about that.
I mean, we hit the oil companies with a windfall tax, and and what the oil companies are doing is just recouping it by sticking keeping the prices high, and it's killing everybody. It's because of the price of fuel's gone up. The price to the consumer for moving the goods around has to go up to cover the cost of the fuel that the trucks are paying for, and the cost in the UK are skyrocketing. I mean, our inflation they reckon is going to be about 11%, and the Chancellor hasn't done us any favours at all because he hasn't. They've stuck another tax on us for national insurance. They put national insurance up. They've also put up. They haven't reduced the price of VAT on anything. So, yeah, we're screwed at the moment. And the average Joe, the average taxpayer in the UK is struggling at affording to live at the moment.
Yeah, and that is a very similar case here in America. It seems as though the rich are doing better and better and better, and everyone else is doing worse and worse and worse. I think the last I checked, it was around between $5 to $7 a gallon for gas here. It fluctuates almost daily depending upon where you go. Inflation is hitting us pretty hard here as well, and you brought up the Barrington Declaration with COVID. I don't know if my audience is familiar with that, but I find that quite interesting because you are right. They made early on. They kind of were right on a number of factors, and with regards to especially the lockdowns, which statistics show. I don't know about in the UK, but here they did not really have any kind of positive effect. They did not work, and part of it was just the way they were done. And early on too, there was, and I understand in a time of pandemic, I understand there's going to be uncertainty, even among the scientific community. You're dealing with something new, and so I understand some of that fear and panic. But there was a number of very deliberate, I think, calculations made early on that in the United States, for instance, as you mentioned about the masks, first it was you were told, oh, don't wear the masks, and then wear the masks. Well, Dr. Fauci here in the United States, who's kind of been the leader, governmental leader on the COVID response, admitted that he lied initially because the fear was that if he told people to wear masks, then the frontline workers here would run out of them, wouldn't have them. And then, once that situation kind of resolved itself, then all of a sudden it's, no, 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 now you need to wear a mask, and what I told you before was because of this. And I understand the reason behind why, Dr. Fauci did that. I mean, it is, of course, important for the frontline workers to, have it rather than Americans hoard it. But when you do stuff like that, especially in the name of science, you erode pretty much all trust. And that's a pretty important thing to have. I mean, not only in government, but within the health and scientific. Now, the Barrington Declaration, however, can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, they took a totally different approach altogether. They looked at it, and they looked at what was coming out of what the government's saying, and they spoke to the actual microbiologists that looked at the whole thing, and they came up with a different way forward, where people just treat it like the flu, because that's pretty much what it was. It's an airborne virus, which is what the flu is, which is the common cold, and there was no need to lock the country down. After the first few weeks, they were getting the data in, and they were looking at the actual data and not what the government were pushing.
Right.
And had the government taken on what the Barrington Declaration would have done, we wouldn't have had lockdown for any more than the 3 weeks to flatten that curve, which it did. And we wouldn't be in the dire straits where we are now. And I'm 100% sure that we would have been far better off having taken the correct way forward. Look at Sweden. They didn't lock down. They gave their people the information and let them use their own common sense to carry on with their lives. They didn't lock down. They didn't insist on people wearing masks everywhere. And then when the vaccines became available, they encouraged people to use them. Unlike other countries, I mean, there's still countries around the world that are locking down and insisting on masks everywhere, and you have to have a COVID passport before you go anywhere. You've got to be sort of triple and quadruple jabbed.
Yeah.
I mean, I was triple jabbed and I got COVID.
Yeah, fortunately, I have not gotten it, at least not that I know of, and I probably would, because I'm kind of immunocompromised in some regards, I probably would have symptoms that would be noticeable. I mean, I would say that, I wouldn't necessarily say that COVID is the equivalent to the flu. I mean, it's quite a bit worse than that, especially in terms of
It depends on
elderly
the individual, yes.
Right.
I'll give you that one. For me, I've had worse colds. I mean, I had a snotty, runny nose for a few days and a tickly cough for about a week, and then I was over it.
Right.
I've had worse colds. From that point of view, maybe it's because I'd had the jabs, maybe because it wasn't, but I think I had COVID in the February of 2020 before we went into the first lockdown in the March. I mean, I had a stinking cold, and that's before we started testing.
Initially, the virus was I mean, that's where you saw a lot of the deaths. I mean, the newer variants have, from what I've been told, the symptoms are a lot milder, and in some cases, many people won't even know that they have some of these newer variants of COVID. Now, the two new variants that are out, it seems as though there's a bit of it seems as though the fear is being elevated again with these new variants, and so I don't know. I'm kind of waiting for the science to evolve on that a little bit before I freak out. I have been vaccinated, although again they say that these newer variants are sort of resistant to the vaccines. But yeah, the other thing too is that I don't know about the UK, but when we say lockdowns, right? here in the United States, to call them lockdowns was a bit of a joke, anyhow, considering that almost everybody and their uncle was considered an essential worker. I mean,
Mm.
people were, out and about, and what who it hurt were the small businesses that had to completely close down. It hurt the poor, of course. I mean, which led to an eviction crisis because again they couldn't leave their home, they couldn't work. So it just seemed to, I guess I looked at it at the time like, what are we doing? I mean, what's if we're not going to do a proper lockdown, right? If we're not going to follow the strictest guidelines, then it's not really a lockdown.
Mm.
Um, but so it's funny that I have not heard here in the United States of considering lockdowns again. It's surprising to hear that that seems to be the case over there.
It was something that was mentioned on the news the other day. I forget which minister or, or who said it, but I picked it up on the news. I thought, I ain't locking down again. I mean, for me, the lockdown it was a double-edged sword. I'm retired, and for us, I mean, we couldn't go anywhere basically. All
Yeah.
the pubs, restaurants, everything was closed down. The essential workers were people working in shops, and it was strict controls on how you went into a shop. You had to have a muzzle on, and you could only go one person per household into a shop, and you had to keep distance and all the rest of it. It was a complete and utter farce. The hospitals were empty because they were fearing that they were going to get overrun with COVID patients. In effect, they didn't. I mean, they built these Nightingale hospitals. They got the military in to build these massive, great big tented field hospitals. Got all the equipment and everything, and then they set all these up around the country. And there was about, I think, half a dozen of them that could take 2,000 patients in at once, and they never got used. The hospitals never got overrun. In fact, TikTok was the busiest thing on during lockdown, with doctors and nurses dancing up and down the wards where they've got no patients, where they're waiting for something to happen. And I think that, and the knock-on effect to all of that is that now we've got somewhere about 6 million people on waiting lists for routine operations, and that is criminal. That's a travesty, and that is it makes us really angry. That
Well, and
people,
not to
I
mention
mean, the amount of people that died needlessly during COVID, they put their deaths down to COVID, although
right.
the vast majority would have died anyway, or they died needlessly because they weren't getting the treatment for the condition that they got, and they way overinflated the COVID deaths. Somebody put, it was a little while ago now, but somebody put a Freedom of Information request in for how many people actually died in England. This is just England, from COVID. It came back 244 people died from COVID. The vast majority of people that was on their death certificates was with COVID. They died from something else, but they mentioned COVID on their death certificate because they died. If somebody was in a road traffic accident and died, and they tested positive within the month of dying, it was down as a COVID death from a road traffic accident. That's what they were doing. They were slurring the figures. But 244 people actually died of COVID in England.
Yeah, I know that the numbers in the United States have been very inflated as well.
Mm.
It's funny because my aunt passed away a few months ago, and she died in a nursing home, and she had a history of health problems, and her death was kind of sudden. Still, I mean, she
Mm.
was doing. She was in one condition one day, and then all of a sudden the next day, it's like, well, she's being rushed to the hospital on her deathbed. And my mother is so, and I don't blame her for being this upset. She called the nursing home several times, and literally after about 5 minutes after being told that she had just died, my mother was like, "Well, what did she die of?" And the response was COVID.
Mm.
And when my mother told me that, I'm like, "Well, wait a minute. You talked to a nurse. She had just died. Doesn't a doctor need to do an autopsy before they just decide cause of death is, COVID?" I mean, and it does seem as though that has become a very convenient,
Mm.
thing just to kind of check off. Um, because and because they marked it as COVID, my mother, they said if she wanted to do the autopsy, and she'd have to, pay for that herself. And it just seems like,
Mm.
well, that's awfully convenient.
Yeah.
Um, if you can
Well,
just check
what
that
they were doing
box.
with care homes in this country, you weren't allowed to go in. They'd virtually locked down care homes, and people couldn't visit their relatives. There was only the staff allowed to go in and out, and if to visit, you had to stand outside and look through the window. And particularly for care homes with patients with dementia, they
Yeah.
just didn't understand what was going on. And yeah, I mean, what they were doing was absolutely criminal. The way they were treating people going into hospital with cancer, dying of cancer, and they weren't allowed to have anybody with them. There was dozens and dozens of examples of children dying in hospital where the parents couldn't go in and be with them when they were dying. I just couldn't make it up, and that's as a consequence of these draconian measures that these people came out with at the time, and it just makes you so angry that, and now looking back with the actual data, and seeing how it could have actually been prevented, just makes you more angry, and the effects that it's had on children.
Kids. Yeah, I was just going to say
Look at
children in
kids.
schools. Yeah.
I mean, trying to tilt. There's a whole raft of young children from sort of the sort of 3-4-year-olds, 5-year-olds that have not only ever seen people like that. So their speech is affected. Everything is affected because they haven't been able to go to school. They haven't
Yeah.
been able to see,
Socialize.
interact with people and get facial expressions. They haven't been able to see how people talk, see how people's mouths move. I mean, how wrong is that? And for anybody under the age of 82, it wasn't such a bad thing. And the average age of people dying was 82, 82-year-olds. They've had a life, and they've locked down schools. They've had kids working from home or not working from home for 2 years.
Yeah.
And there's a whole raft of that whole raft of young people from 20 down have been, their education has been curtailed, and they won't get it back.
I agree. I mean, I'm going to just. I think again, people are going to be surprised at that what you just said about the age risk that was most at risk in the UK with COVID. And I wonder if because in America it was much lower. I mean, we were talking about even 30 and 40-year-olds, and I kind of would equate that to the fact that again, you have a healthcare system in the United Kingdom that allows people to have the routine care so that if they so choose.
Yeah.
Whereas in America, a lot of people don't even have a primary care physician, or if they do, they don't even go in for physicals or whatnot because they still have to pay those enormous copays, and it's just not,
Mm.
financially feasible for people. And so I think that the state of people's health in general in America was probably a lot less than it would be over there, which might explain that kind of discrepancy in the affected age range of COVID.
Yeah. For us, I mean, they said almost from the outset that it's older people that are really susceptible to it. Um, and, and and if you look at it, the average age of people that were dying from it was up in their 80s. Were older people that have had a life. So so to lock up young people that were at minimal risk from it just didn't make sense. And I believe it's that constant propaganda of instilling fear into the population that people are still in this country. You still see people walking around with masks on, and these cloth masks that don't do anything in the first place. Or you have to wear a face covering. No, you don't. You're better off not wearing it. You're better off getting some of the the stuff. Our immune system has been trashed over the last 2 years because we haven't been travelling around. We haven't been getting the coughs and colds that we normally get. So consequently, and I can guarantee now we're just going into our summer holidays. When the kids all come back in September, the first few weeks they'll be all coughing and sneezing and everything like that, because it happens every single year. When the kids go back to school, they all get colds and snotty noses, and it's happened for millennia, and it'll carry on happening.
Do
And
you think this propaganda is a? I mean, I think some of there's sort of a lane that's been opened as the trust in government has fallen steadily in both of our countries for many decades, and so there's sort of been a opening for a lot of this propaganda and fear to come into. Because I mean, when you look at the wars that we're fighting across the world, when you look at the general state of the economy, you look at the crises like climate change and energy, there's a lot of uncertainty in the world that can be exploited. And it seems as though there's been it's been politically advantageous and it's been economically advantageous for a few. Um, what would you say to that about, I mean, would you attribute this sort of generalized fear to this sort of state of unease that's been kind of existing all along?
I think if you go back and you look at particularly conflict, let's just have a quick look at conflicts over the last 40 years. We got into a scrap 40 years ago with Argentina over the Falkland Islands. That's by and by. We had the first Gulf War where Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait. Who was it? George Bush Senior, and
Yeah.
Was it Tony Blair at the time? No, who
I
was
think
it
so.
at the
Yeah,
time?
I'm pretty sure it was Tony. Yeah.
We went in
Oh, wait a
anyway,
minute.
and that's the first Gulf War, 92, 1990, 91. It was George Bush Senior, Tony Blair. Was it Tony
Was it
Blair?
still- was-
No, it wasn't
Tony Blair
back
was.
then.
What? No, Tony Blair was. I know that Tony Blair was the prime minister when George W. Bush Jr.
Yeah.
there.
That's when we went into Iraq the second time.
Right, the second time. So that's what I was thinking.
Weapons
so I
of
don't
mass
know if he
destruction.
was.
Yeah,
Yeah, well, we're still looking for them.
we're still looking for them. Yeah,
Yeah,
we know
we'll
they
find
had
them.
them because we sold them.
Sure, that is true.
Yeah, we've got a bill here. Look, we know they got them. They just did them well. Yeah, I mean that. So the second Gulf War into Iraq, and then the Balkans. Don't forget the Balkans. You look at what happened in Bosnia, and then Kosovo, Macedonia, and then 9/11 happened, and we went into Afghanistan, and then we went back into Iraq, and then we spent 20 years in Afghanistan with an absolute chaos coming out, which shouldn't have happened. And what we've done to that country, we should hang our heads in shame. I mean, I did 3 tours there, and I know that I left it in a better place than it was when I first went there. And now, I mean, we've let the people down really, really badly, particularly the young women in that country. Any female that's sort of 20 and under, they've only ever known a certain amount of freedom, and that's been taken away from them. And that's our fault. We did that to them.
I mean, well, we didn't have a clear plan going in to begin with.
No.
It was a very knee-jerk reaction, and you know, Afghanistan. There's a history there of people trying to conquer that land and failing.
You don't need to tell me. We've been kicked out of there 3 times now.
So it seems as though the history might have been a little bit of a like, you might want to think this through a little bit more. Of course, Iraq too.
Yeah.
No, I don't know if staying in Afghanistan, I don't know what that would have done.
I think what we had in there, I mean, we finished combat operations in 2014, and we stayed in the country as a stabilisation force, giving assistance to the Afghan authorities, the Afghan National Army and National Police Service, as mentors, and they were doing most of it. And we were just providing a bit of air cover. I mean, the Americans were giving us some air cover. When they pulled out, there was only 2,500 Americans in the country anyway, giving that support. And Biden just pulled the rug out and mugged the rest of us off. The British went round to the other NATO allies asking for some help to just bolster us up to stay there, to give that bit of cover. The Germans, the frogs, and everybody else said, no, we're not interested. And we couldn't do it by ourselves at the time. We just didn't have the resources to stay there. And we had to pull out the same, and it was just absolute chaos. But you look at all those wars that we fought, or all those conflicts that we've been involved in, at the bottom line of it, somebody's making a hell of a lot of money out of it. And that's where it's all driven. It's all driven by taxpayers' money. And it's not government's money. Governments don't have any money. It's taxpayers that fund the government. It's taxpayers that foot the bill for just about everything. And it's the private sector, not the public sector, that fund everything. Without the private sector being lucrative, without the private sector making enough money to pay taxes, the public sector can't operate. And it's the private sector that's the one that suffer all the time.
Well, okay. Let me think about that for a minute. I would argue, maybe we're talking about 2 different things when we're talking about the private and public sector. I am taking it that one of the problems that we have, especially in America, and I imagine there too, is a private sector that's sort of run amok. You know, you've got corporations that pay 0 to very little in taxes. You know, in the United States, you know, there's still a huge struggle for unionization efforts. I mean, we've got people here that are, you know, making a minimum wage that is just criminal anyhow. I mean, we need to increase the minimum wage, which we can't seem to do. And so we've got a lot of this rampant social inequality where you have a public sector, citizens that are barely able to afford their rent. A lot of them have no health care, no benefits. And yet you see the profit margins of these few corporations just keep rising and rising and rising. So I don't think
And they
we're
pay
talking,
less and less and less.
right. So I don't think when you say private sector, you're not necessarily referring to this whole
Oh no,
corporatized.
it's not the big corporations. It's the small businesses.
Right. Okay.
It's the small to medium businesses that run the whole thing. Big corporations, they find ways of not paying taxes. They find ways of offloading all of their profits to the shareholders. That
Right.
find ways of sticking their money in offshores. They find loopholes of not paying the taxes. It's the small guys. It's the small to medium sized businesses, private businesses that are the ones that are funding the whole thing. You take a big corporation, a small firm that's supplying. Let's take, for instance, Walmart, and I suspect that they operate the same as Tesco's, Sainsbury's, and
Oh,
all
yeah.
those chains. For us in the UK, Tesco's is a bit like Walmart. We've got Asda, which is Walmart, but they'll pay an invoice on 90 days. So if you provide stuff to Walmart or Asda or Tesco's, they'll pay their, and you put your invoice in for it. You won't get your money for 90 days. If you're being supplied by a smaller name, you need to keep them going, so you need to pay your invoices on 30 days. But the big boys don't pay it for 90 days. So it's the small firms that are ones that are really struggling. And it's the farmers that are at the
Yes.
bottom of the food chain that are supplying everything and getting properly mugged off for it. But it's the big supermarkets and that are creaming it off, and they're the ones that are siphoning off the money and hiding it and not paying enough tax.
And corrupting
So
politicians. And do you
yeah,
allow that over
and
there? Lobbying? This where you lobbying?
yes, I think there's some strict rules on it, but yeah, it goes on all the time.
Jeez.
I mean, we've got a daft daft system over here. We've got 600. I think it's about 630 elected MPs in the House of Commons. We've got something like about eight. I think somebody's even saying that it's about 830 unelected House of Lords.
So how does the House of Lords work?
Right. So the House of Commons or the government are the ones that come up with laws. So it goes through the House of Commons, then it goes up to the House of Lords, who look at it and make amendments to it, send it back down to the House of Commons, who get the knock because they changed some of the key aspects of what they wanted to put in place. Then they then send it back up to the House of Lords after they've done some more amendments, and it goes backwards and forwards a couple of times, and then eventually it will get put into law. The problem that we've got, and this is fairly crucial for Brexit. We've got 800 unelected Lords in the House of Lords. The vast majority of those were Remainers and still are, that wanted to stay in the European Union, and they've done everything they can possibly do to undermine the government leaving the European Union. Every step of the way. In fact, the other day I saw Sir Keir Starmer went to Berlin. He's in Berlin striking a deal with the German Chancellor for when he gets elected as Prime Minister to bring us back into the single market, to take us partly back into Europe. and that's a fact. And that is what they've been doing. They've undermined Brexit. Personally, from my point of view, what we should do now is to say, right, we're going to leave totally the European Union, cut all ties, and we're going to trade with you under World Trade Organisation, WTO, BOMP. We'll deal with you exactly the same way as we deal with America or any other country outside of Europe. We'll go full WTO. And if you want to put tariffs on stuff, fine, do it. If you want to put borders up, fine, do it. We're not going to put borders up. We're not going to put tariffs on. But we will treat you the same as we do the rest of the world. And Northern Ireland, scrap that Northern Ireland Protocol, because that's not worth the paper it's written on. It's disadvantaged Northern Ireland. Scrap Article 16, get rid of that, because that's done exactly the same. That has been a hindrance rather than a help. And bring Northern Ireland back into the rest of the United Kingdom. And if the European Union want to put a border up, put it across the Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland. That's where the border should be. But no, they put it down the Irish Sea and disadvantaged Northern Ireland. I mean, it's costing people in Northern Ireland a huge amount of money just to buy anything from the UK, because, or making it so difficult for people bringing stuff in from the UK mainland, because they're having all these checks on it, making them put all this paperwork in place. And the goods are no different to what they were before, and the European Union are saying, well, you're not working to the same standards as us. Well, we never have done. You've never been able to come up to our standards. We've always had our high standards and just dealt with your low standards.
So, let's say that Brexit were to, if you were to, for instance, rejoin the European Union, would
Yep.
those checks would go away then, or
Well, they kind of would or wouldn't. They right. If for us to go back into the European Union would be a massive kick in the nuts for democracy, for one thing. For two, we would be under totally different rules. We would have to have the euro. We couldn't keep our own currency, which was a stumbling block right from day one.
right? Okay.
So we'd have to have the euro, and then we would be properly disadvantaged with the exchange rate while we were transferring over to the euro. And then we would be hit with even bigger, an awful lot more money than we were paying before. We were and probably still are a net contributor to the European Union, and we always have been. We've always put in more than we've ever got out. And the thing that really rubs me up the wrong way is that we give them all this money, and then they give us a little bit back for projects, and then they insist on having a logo put on, funded by the European Union. How does that work then? That's funded by UK taxpayers or European taxpayers, or a part of the European taxpayers.
Yeah. So it's hard. It's hard to wrap my head around, just because as I said,
It's a minefield.
Now, one thing that I suppose they're sort of talking about, a comparison sort of to how a Brexit type thing will work, is like with the abortion issue here in the United States. where we're going to be talking about. I mean, we are literally talking about putting up borders on states and having checkpoints, for pregnancy checks before leaving the state, so that I mean, and so that's the only kind of equation I can kind of think of in terms of having this being a whole for all intents and purposes, border wise, to all of a sudden sort of having these heavy divisions, having checkpoints and having new establishments of borders for all intents and purposes. So it almost seems, in that respect, it would be simpler to. I mean, it seems like you haven't really fully left, as you said. I mean, Brexit hasn't fully taken effect, and so maybe that's why it seems as though it would just be easier just to go back into to that to eliminate some of these hurdles. But you think that there's another. I mean, how this is incredibly complicated, isn't it? This whole Brexit.
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, we had a democratic vote. Let's lay it right out. The biggest single democratic vote in history of this country, where over 30 million people, 35 million people voted. 17.4 million people voted to leave the European Union. That's 52% of the population voted to leave. 48%, that's 1.3 million less, voted to stay. Now, to turn that over and go back into the European Union destroys democracy. End of story. That's it. You might as well not have democracy. You might as well just have anarchy.
Well,
because
one
that's
of the
what it's
things
doing.
that they back after this, and again, I say this from my perspective, knowing what I know, the American media has been very anti-Brexit.
Yeah,
that's been.
Well,
so
we know that from your president, your Irish president.
You can have him if you'd like. We'll trade
No,
him.
no, you keep him.
Yeah,
Out
Joe
of
Biden.
330 million people, that's the best one you can come up with. You keep him.
Yeah, no kidding. I mean, when it was down to him and Donald Trump, I'm like, really? This is where we are?
Is that the best you come up with? I mean, we had Boris.
Yeah, well, I was going to offer you Donald Trump, too. Because we would package him up for you guys in a hurry.
Well, the one thing with Trump is that he was one of the only presidents that never took you into a war, and that you got to be thankful for.
That's true. Yes. I'm trying to think. Well, in
the last 50 years, anyway.
He didn't start a new war, but he did. Intensify a lot of things. What I will say about Donald Trump is that he initially, when he first came into office, he did seem to be very much against. It seemed like he was going to be a force against the military-industrial complex. The profiteers of war.
Yeah.
And so, to that regard, yes, the temptations to start another war. I even give him credit, and a lot of people think I'm insane, for reaching out to North Korea. I mean, the whole saber rattling at the start was a bit nerve-wracking, but everyone's like, "Oh my God, he went into North Korea," and I'm like, "Yeah, we're talking about nuclear war."
Well, at least he opened the dialogue with them.
Right, exactly. I mean, and what we've seen before is this sort of egotism, ironically, with Joe Biden, for instance. I think it was either him or Barack Obama who said, "Oh, I wouldn't dignify North Korea by entering into their country because that just that's a get for them." Well, yeah, with that attitude though, you're not going to get anywhere to start with. I mean, so that whole and again, I say ironic because when we think of egotism, Trump seems to epitomize that, and yet he was willing to go and start that dialogue and venture into North Korea. And I don't care what other people say of his motives or whatnot for doing that. The fact is that I applauded him for doing that. Reaching across the aisle, and it would be nice if we saw more of that elsewhere in the world, especially with. I would have liked to have a whole different approach with Iran rather than that saber rattling. But Donald Trump and even Joe Biden, which again, so back to my original point. So when it came to that vote to leave Brexit, the American media spun this tale that it turns out that they've done polling and they found out that most of the people that voted in that election didn't know what they were voting for and they were confused and they didn't fully understand. And again, I say this knowing that American media had a bias one way in favor, and so I'm just trying to get your insights on that.
That was that was prevalent over here as well. That was pushed from the Remainer side, that we didn't know what we were doing. Of course we knew what we're doing. You only need to look at what the European were imposing on us over decades. We were in the European Union for over 40 years, and what they were, the continuous bureaucracy that they were forcing on us, and the vast amount of British people that got any ounce a sense just didn't want it. Yes, I knew that it would curtail, it would make travelling across Europe for us a little bit different. We would only be allowed to stay in Europe for 90 days in 180 days. And so we'd only be in there for 3 months and have to come out for 3 months before we can go back in for 3 months, which would make travelling difficult. We knew they would do that. We knew they would make life difficult for us for leaving. And that's been proved time and time and time again. And I just want to answer a couple of the comments that's come in here. Yes, the UK's always had its own currency. But if you look at the rules for joining the EU, part of those rules now is that you take up the EU, the euro. So if we were to go and rejoin, and yes, Labour have said, we won't rejoin no, they will. It's written all over them. Starmer was a big Remainer, but he's pushing this about that. No, we won't rejoin the EU. But if he does, the rules say that you'll have to take over their currency once you meet certain criteria. Anybody joining the European Union now has to take up the euro, and that would be us, and we would be punished even more than we were originally. We were a net contributor. I think we were second net contributor on the list. We were paying billions a year into the EU, and we were getting back millions. So we were getting back a small portion. We were propping up 19 of the lower countries that weren't putting in, that were taken out. 19 countries worth of money we were putting into the European Union. And that's a fact. That's one of the main reasons that we pulled out of it. The open border policy has crippled this country. Over the last 10 years, we've had 3 million people come into the country. 3 million. We're now up to, I think it was about 68 million people that we know about. So it's close to sort of 70 million with all the illegals that have come in over the last 20 years.
Okay. When you talk about, so maybe I'm confused. So the open borders, that is where people that are members of the United European Union, rather,
Yep.
have basically. I mean, there's not
You can just travel around the European Union at will.
at will.
No problem at all. You can cross the borders. There are kind of no internal borders in the EU. I mean, you can go from Norway down to Spain, and you don't need to go for a border check.
And I mean, does this include like just you can just move as well? I mean, does that affect
Technically, yes.
citizenship?
Technically, yes. In reality, it's a little bit more difficult to go. But European citizens came into there's somewhere around 3 million European citizens applied to stay here in the UK when we left
Okay.
the EU. 3 million citizens, 5 million were here, came to the UK to live and work. 3 million applied to stay. That's not including all the illegals that came in from their porous borders outside the EU. And one of the main routes was coming up through Tunisia and Turkey and Greece. And once they get into Greece, then they head for Calais.
So
because I mean, it's, war-torn France is not a safe place at the moment, and they're all coming over claiming asylum from France. They've crossed half of Europe to get to Calais.
So with Brexit in place,
Yeah.
so there's now a different process from going from what would have been like, as you said, just at will travel. Now it's more like an international travel situation.
Yeah. Yeah, so I don't think they brought it in just yet, but I think we have to. Some countries in Europe we have to have a visa of some sort, or
Right.
we have to clear in, and we have to clear out. We have to do a customs form if we're going into the country and coming out. I mean, it's a bit of an embuggerance, but we used to do it. I think 20 years we used to do it to go into Europe. I used to drive a truck for a living 25 years ago, and maybe 30 years ago now. Yeah, time flies when you're enjoying yourself. But we used to pick a trailer up or we used to leave on a Sunday afternoon, get a ferry across into France, and you usually have to give a 20 franc bung to the copper if you had any more than 200 litres of diesel in your diesel tanks, because they'll dip your diesel tanks. So if you've got any more than sort of 200 litres, you'd have to pay the excess for it. So that was one of the things. When you have a customs form, we call them a T1 form. So we used to queue up on the steps in Dover to clear customs. You get your stamp on your T forms. You go to see your agent to get your other paperwork before you got onto the boat. And then when you got off at the French side, you have to take your papers in. They give another stamp. So you give the copper a bung for the extra diesel that you've got in your tank, and away you go. And then you have to, the borders that you were crossing at the time, some borders you had to stop at and get a stamp on your customs papers. And then when you got to your final destination, if we were going down to, say, Spain or Portugal or Italy, we're going to what we call a tier park, big lorry parks. You find an agent, you give them your paperwork, and they'll go off. And they'll get the customs clearance done, get the VAT paid. Once they've got the clearance done, then you could go out and you tip the load, then you got reloaded, and then the whole process again, getting forms done. And that's what it used to be like. And that was in the European Economic Community. That was the free market, as it were. And say the European Union evolved over time to become the bureaucratic beast that it is now. Do you know that it cost the the European citizens about £1 million a month to move from Brussels down to Strasbourg for 4 days,
Really?
and then to move it back up to Brussels again. The whole lot. I mean, the whole shooting match. Everybody. All the clerks, all the secretaries, the ministers, everybody. They load it all up onto trucks, take it all the way down to Strasbourg, unload it all. They sit there for 4 days, rabbiting, then they pack it all up again and bring it all back up to Brussels. That cost £1 million a month to do that. They've got, I think they were saying about 120 limousines that are based in Brussels just to run the diplomats about.
Jeez. Yeah, no, I mean, bureaucracy.
They
is
got a
incredible.
commissary. They got a commissary in the European Union building, and anybody that works in the European Union can go into the commissary and pay peanuts for stuff. I mean, tax free. I mean, they give them loads of stuff, and this was all coming out from our when was it 2016? I think we had European elections where the Brexit party got 29 MPs, European MPs, into Brussels. And they was telling us exactly what was going on. The gravy train that is the European Union, the amount of money that European taxpayers' money that they waste is incredible. That's the reason that the UK wanted to leave the European Union. We love Europe. Don't get me wrong, I love Europe. I love travelling to Europe. I've got loads of European friends, and they all understand why we left. I mean, France and Germany have had to pick up some of the slack, and some of the lower down countries like Denmark and Sweden and some of the other countries have had to step up and pay a bit more in. And some of the countries that were benefactors have had to put some in. I mean, they've almost crippled Greece and Italy. They've almost bankrupted them. I mean, you just look at the last couple of years over the COVID thing and what they did to Italy in the first few months, and they promised them all this COVID recovery fund, and they've never seen it. The country's on its knees.
Yeah, we know a thing or two about that in America too. This whole, promises of recovery funds and them not going to where they're supposed to. So, with all of these similarities in terms of just sort of the dysfunction that we're seeing, what would you looking at America? What would you see as, okay, you guys are insane? What do you? I mean, how would you sort of?
What? How would we become like America? I don't think we would, actually. I'm quite happy the way we are. I think, like I said earlier, the best thing that the new Prime Minister coming in needs to do is quite a few big, bold moves to get rid of the European Convention on Human Rights, to get rid of the Northern Ireland Protocol, to get rid of Article 16, and to go full WTO with the European Union, and that's a start. And then we can start looking at our economic recovery, because at the moment, the way things are, we're going to sink. I mean, they've got to promote the entrepreneurs, the small businesses, small, medium businesses. They've got to give them some sort of tax breaks to be able to generate the tax income to be able to pay for all the services and everything that the private sector or the public sector have got, and start paying back some of this capital loan that we've got, the £3 trillion that we've borrowed.
Was that from the International Monetary Fund? Those loans,
Yeah,
IMF loans. Yeah,
I mean,
yeah. That's
you look at our war chest, or we only finished paying the Americans back for the Second World War in 2004 for all the assistance you gave us during the war. Nobody else paid back. The Germans never paid us back for they started it. No, we didn't. Yes, you did. You invaded Poland. But the UK's been the one that's coughed up for everything for decades, and it's and for the European Union to try and take away. It was quite funny that they were giving all these doom and glooms about the financial sector leaving Canary Wharf and London to move it to Frankfurt. Well, that didn't happen, did it? in fact, we got more companies moved into the UK than we did leave in the financial sector. So we're still the clearinghouse for the European Union.
So, do you think that the next prime minister will make those bold moves, or I mean, what are you seeing playing out right now?
Cool. You didn't half know how to ask a difficult question. Watching what's been going on the last week or so. Today, who got kicked out today? Kemi got kicked out today. Yesterday it was Tom Tugendhat. Today was Kemi Belganet. We've got three left in, which is Richie Sunak, Penny Mordaunt, and Liz Truss. I don't know. They've all got their downsides. I mean, Richie Sunak. Yeah, I don't know about him. He's the one that's put us in this place. He was the one that's borrowed all this money, and he's the one that's inflicted these higher taxes on us at the moment. And the noise that he's making, it doesn't sound like he's going to cut much anytime soon. Liz Truss, she's saying that she's going to start cutting some of the stuff, going to cut the VAT on fuel for a bit to help out. Penny Mordaunt, she's gone a little bit on the wokey side at the moment. I mean, some of her ideas. I mean, to be honest, they have had a bit of a campaign against her. They have been sticking the knives in on her. There has been a bit of a campaign against her, shall we say, and a lot of negativity have come out. I don't know which way it's going to fall. I think if Rishi Sunak goes up against either of those two, I think it's going to come off second. I think when it goes out to the general Conservative members, I think he might end up falling on his sword, because he's the one with the knife out stabbing Boris Johnson in the chest. Wasn't stabbing him in the back with it, he stuck in his chest. So he's the one that kind of initiated his downfall. I mean, to be honest, Boris was his own worst enemy. And some of the policies that he followed just weren't. You just knew it wasn't coming from him, and it was coming from the long-haired general. You can see where some of that stuff came from. The following this green agenda and this net zero malarkey. The UK produces less than 1% of the global CO2 emissions. What we do ain't going to make a jot of difference. The likes of
Well, no,
China,
not
India,
not without the
America
rest of the
need.
world following suit.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
we might as well just not bother. I mean, we might as well just get on with what we've got. We need to do some serious stuff. We need to be. We need to look at the way that we are producing our own power for a start. We need to bring on some of these small nuclear reactors, set them up around the country. We need to start doing some fracking to I mean, we sat on a gold mine of shale gas, and we just left it there. And we, check this out. We got rid of all our gas storage and subbed it out to the Dutch. So the Dutch are storing all our gas. You couldn't make that up. We're buying in power from France. They've just been laying a big power cable from France across to Stubbington, and and we're buying power from France because we can't produce enough of our own. We've subbed all this out. We're not self-sufficient. Like we've never been fully self-sufficient, but for selling off our infrastructure, we're mugs. I mean, China owns half of our infrastructure. The French own some of our infrastructure. Everybody else owns it apart from us. Successive governments have flogged it off to the rest of the world. It doesn't happen in other countries, does it? Can you imagine the French selling off their vineyards? Ain't going to happen, is it? The Germans ain't going to give up half of their car manufacturing so we can have it. No. They're not going to. I mean, we've had successive governments flogging off our assets. I mean, Gordon Brown practically gave away our gold reserves. That was criminal. Sold it off for half the price of what it was worth, and shouldn't have sold it in the first place.
When would you attribute a lot of the? I mean, I would guess the Second World War probably for you guys kind of marked the decline that hasn't really risen back from economically and socially, and I mean, a lot of things have changed too since the Second World War. I mean, that sort of was an impetus for the United Nations. It certainly added to had an impact on the European Union in the first place.
Yeah.
And even with NATO, right? I mean, we have these relics from a time where things have kind of verged away from their original intent, or have not worked to the conclusion that was anticipated. They've kind of outlasted their time, and it seems as though there's been no. I mean, all of this stuff is incredibly complicated to understand. I mean, Brexit. I mean, I'm still again. It's just very difficult to try to wrap your head around and understand all of the different working parts to it. And that same thing is with NATO and the United Nations, and you've got all of these different things, and it just seems very chaotic and disorganized in a way that we're almost making it worse in trying to, disentangle. How much do you think of these other issues, like with the United Nations and with NATO and all of this, how do you see that kind of intersecting with Brexit too? Because I imagine that those have some crossover issues. I mean, for instance, like the Convention on Human Rights. I mean, the United Nations has the United Nations Charter on Human Rights as well, and which kind of boggles the mind as to why we need to have all these different versions of the same declarations. But as you mentioned, that's one of the things that you you want to repeal from in terms of the European Union's Convention on Human Rights. Um, so you see what I mean? It just seems like there's all of these different elements that are trying to intersect with each other, and then you try to disentangle one from the other, and it just seems like that just makes it worse. Is that?
Yeah, kind of. I don't know whether it makes it worse or whether it certainly hinders. I mean, you look at, for instance, NATO. NATO says that membership of NATO, all for one for all. If you want to be a member of NATO, you need to spend 2% of your GDP on your defence.
Right.
Now, the UK and America are probably the only NATO members that are actually spending that or maybe a little bit more on defence. I mean, we've spent a bit more on it because, I mean, we've just spent a huge amount of money on the two new aircraft carriers that we've got sat over in Portsmouth Harbour at the moment. We haven't got the aircraft to stick on them. I mean, we've got a handful of aircraft from you guys, and we did a little tour of the Far East last year with Queen Elizabeth and a little entourage, and we had a dozen of our own, and we had about 15 of your F-35s operating on that, and got up the noses of the Chinese slightly down in the South China Sea. The other aircraft carrier, I mean, she's just come back in, and she was up in Norway supporting a NATO operation up there, or NATO exercise, should I say, not operation, during the winter. They're waiting to go out again, or they're doing some modifications, doing bits and pieces, whatever they're doing, but they're sat in port at the moment. The fact that we haven't really got enough seagoing crews to man them both at once, and the entourages that go with him is neither here nor there. But the other NATO countries aren't really pulling their weight. Let's face it, they never have done. It's always been ourselves and the Americans that have been leading NATO. And I've been on several operations, NATO operations, where I've been working alongside other NATO nations, and they've come in with smaller amounts of troops than we've put in. But the UN, I mean, is that really fit for purpose? Is it just a load of windbags, a load of posturing?
Well, it's part of that bureaucracy that.
Yeah,
I mean,
look at the size of the headquarters there in New York. It's huge. Cost billions.
And again, it seems as though this the intent is great, the initial purpose, the idea, but again, you have this infectious bureaucracy that gets into the mix, and yeah, I mean, it's almost as if like. Even when it comes to government at this point, the Prime Minister and the President of the United States, I mean, they've and perhaps they've always been figureheads to a certain extent, but it seems pretty clear they're not running the show anymore. I mean,
No.
whether or not they ever were is a matter of debate. But these days, there does seem to be some sort of a person behind the curtain type of thing going on where. And you just see this bureaucracy infecting everything. I mean, obviously, someone's profiting from that, but it's quite fascinating. That
You want to know where it all lies? Follow the money.
yeah,
Look where all the money is going, and then you'll find who's at the bottom of it all, or the top of it, whichever way you look.
yeah, and
But that's where it is. It's where the money is. And somebody is profiting, and somebody's
definitely.
making a huge amount of money, and it's not the small people, it's not the ones that are coughing up all the time. It's not the small medium entrepreneurs that are working themselves to death to try and put food on the table and pay their taxes.
Absolutely,
And
yeah.
it's these big corporations that have got far too much power, and
And
somebody's making far too much money.
there and both again, it's fascinating to think that the United Kingdom and the United States are both just on this decline economically, and it's just, I mean, this was something that would be one time considered unfathomable to even consider. You look at the rise of China. You look at the so. Is this maybe kind of a shifting of the guard? Do you think, where the United States and the UK are just sort of becoming less dominant in the world, or do you see this as something that we can kind of reverse and try to go back in a different direction?
I'm not sure whether we can go back. I'm not sure whether we can recover. But you just look at what China's doing across the world at the moment. Look at the influence that they're putting into Africa.
Oh yeah, the
Look at what
infrastructure, the yeah.
look at what they're doing for Africa. Um, Look at, I mean, just influence in Africa. Look at what they're doing. I don't know how much they're doing in India, but India is certainly benefiting from what's going on there. I mean, the Middle East, it's hard to know what's really going on in the Middle East at the moment.
Yeah, that's
I
still
mean,
a
they're still
tinderbox.
they're still at each other's throats. You've only got to look around. I mean, down at the Yemen, down in Aden, round sort of that part of Saudi Arabia down the bottom there, across into Oman. Come further up, look at the Straits of Hormuz. Look what the Iranians are doing across the straits there. They're still, I mean, we've still got warships down there. We're still having to escort tankers in and out of the Straits of Hormuz because they're getting attacked. And if they stray anywhere near the opposite side of the straits, then the Iranians are boarding them and doing all sorts of nasty stuff. There's conflict going on all over the joint.
Yeah, that's for
and,
sure.
and it's always gone on, and it always will. And whether we can do much about it, I don't know. I don't know whether China's got too much of a hold on it. I mean, look what Putin's doing at the moment, and what Russia's having an impact on trying to get back what was the USSR. It never will. But if he gets away with annexing parts of Ukraine, then it ain't going to stop there. I mean, he's already taken over the Crimea and having an influence in that neck of the woods. He's already got blockade of Odessa, where most of the stuff came out of the Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine is pretty much the breadbasket of Europe. I mean, we get most of our or Europe gets most of its food grain from there. So, yeah, I mean, it's whether we could come back, whether I can tell one thing, it ain't going to end pretty. It's not
Yeah,
going to be a
that's
pretty ending.
kind of the fear that I have too. Yeah. This has been a fascinating conversation. We've got a few minutes left. So, first, I want to tell my listeners and people that are watching where they can find and learn more about you and listen to your podcasts. I know you've got a couple of them.
Yep. Well, I've got the Tim Hill podcast, and there's 24 half-an-hour episodes of my life. Anybody that suffers from insomnia, it might be a cure. Might also give you a few nightmares. And then I've done a series 3, and I've just recorded episode 132.
Oh, congratulations! Wow.
Yeah, that's still growing. Still more and more people signing up to come on the old podcast, and it's all about other people's lives. It's all about where they've come from. So I start off, I have a basic format. I ask people when and where they were born. I ask them to describe what it was like where they grew up, the schools they went to and the education they received, and we'll kick that about for a bit. And then we'll look at their work-life history, and then we'll see where the conversation takes us, and we'll focus in on a specific area of their life. I also do a Thursday live stream from 7 o'clock until 9 o'clock British summertime at the moment, or GMT +1, and that goes out, and some weeks we have a special where we talk about a special subject like mental health issues or something like that. Other weeks we have open forums where people pose questions and we try and answer them. We normally have a few special guests come on and have some fun and talk about all sorts of rubbish for a couple of hours. And that's me. So I'm on YouTube and I'm across all the old podcast platforms. So just look out for the Tim Hill podcast, Ordinary People's Extraordinary Stories, and you'll come across me.
Well, I want to thank you again for coming on. This has been a fascinating conversation. I've learned a lot. I'm just still trying to wrestle with some of the complexities of all of this. It's because you've got such
you and me both.
Well, I mean, from my perspective, you've got a far more complicated system of government than what well, maybe not. Maybe actually what you have is simpler. I don't know. It certainly seems more complex from what we have here, just learning about the different, like the House of Lords, for instance, how that worked. So this has been a fascinating conversation. I love to have you back to talk about some more of these issues in more depth at some point in the future. But I want to thank you for joining us today. Sorry I've been feeling a little bit under the weather, so I haven't been my full self. But yeah, I want to thank you guys, everybody, for listening. I want to thank you if you're watching, and please check out our friends' podcasts here. Ordinary Citizens sounds absolutely wonderful. I'm going to want to check that out. I didn't see that on my sheet. So the Ordinary Citizens one. So that's kind of a fascinating one, because I love that type of stuff, hearing about where people come from and their different life experiences and such. That's a sociologist in me, I guess. And you said how many episodes you've done of that?
There's 132. I've just recorded last night. It was 132.
Wow.
So that's over the last 2 years. And I've spoken to some fascinating people over the years. I've spoken to a lot of naval types, naval officers, submariners, a few army types in there. I've spoken to forensic psychologists. I've spoken to entrepreneurs. Fitness people, authors. I'll speak to anybody and get their story. And,
wow. And that's from pretty much anywhere in the world, or is that just
anywhere in the world? I've spoken to people in Australia, South America. Quite a lot of people in America and Canada. Lots of people across the UK. So I'm not fussy who I talk to. Me.
No, I'm going to check that out then, because that is something that's right up my alley. I love just.
Well, so if you do, just click the old subscribe button. That helps a bit.
Of course, I absolutely will. Okay, well, thank you so much again, and for everybody out there, we will see you right here next Tuesday at 2 o'clock. Thank you so much. We'll see you next week.